Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A motionless woman lies in her bed, the sleeping form of her husband bunched at her side. She studies his shape in the smoky glass of the dresser mirror, watching as the blanket, stretched over the apex of his shoulder, tightens and sags with his breathing. Other shapes linger in the dark, and some are recognizable. The housecoat on the back of the open bedroom door, a stack of books on the dresser, the painting above the bed reflected in the pebble-dashed glow of the mirror, mundanities of the bedroom, all made strange by the gloom of pre-dawn. She listens to her husband's snores, the swish of the shifting covers as he kicks a leg into the coolness of the night, and then the sound of something unexpected. The croak of floorboards near the foot of the bed. She looks toward the sound and sees a shadow move past the mirror and out of the room. There are footsteps in the hall. She stiffens. Reaching a shaky hand behind her, she tries to nudge her husband awake, but the awkward, blind effort is not enough, and she's too afraid to look away. Instead, she cranes her neck and listens. But all she can hear is the blood hammering behind her ears and the thumping of her quickened heart. She pushes the covers to the side, lowers her thin legs over the edge of the bed, and pads across the thin brown carpet to peek down the hall. The weathered console piano sits forgotten in the corner. The shape of the antique grandfather clock looms near the front door. The silent living room expands, pressing into the mess of shadows that make up the yard, the street, the town, letting them seep through the windows and climb up the walls. She advances, each timid step measured out to 4 even strokes of the clock's pendulum. Each anxious moment a new fight between the urge to know and the urge to turn and run. With a flick of a switch, the wall sconces blaze their harsh yellow light, and the room snaps back. The black void in the windows is replaced with a funhouse mirror. She sees herself in the smears of color in the glass. The piano keys grin at her in the reflection. She peers around the corner. The refrigerator rumbles in the kitchen, its gentle thrum vibrating across the peeling linoleum floor. She moves to the front door, turns the knob, and pulls. The deadbolt clacks against the strike plate. The doors and windows are locked. The house is empty, and the spell of fear is broken. Relief washes over her, and it's enough to blind her to the subtle changes she hasn't noticed. Like how 3 books have somehow dislodged themselves from the shelf and now lie open on the coffee table. How the temperature has suddenly dropped and the room is freezing cold. How, while she was lost in her reflection, a door slowly opened behind her. She clicks off the light and starts for the bedroom when the silence is broken by a single note from the piano. She stops and looks. No one is there, and she wonders if the sound was just her imagination. But then the note comes again, as if in answer, followed by another and another. The beginning of a melancholy song played lightly but deliberately, by unseen hands. A black ball of fear rises in the pit of her stomach. Her throat thickens, and she backs away. The fog of her panicked breath hangs in the icy air. Tears begin to fall from her widened eyes. She turns and fumbles with the lock, flings open the door, and runs out into the night. Though it's mid-September in the Kootenays, it's warmer outside than inside the house. The lump in her throat shrinks just enough to allow her to scream as she sprints down the cracked driveway and collapses on the street. Dogs begin to bark as the darkened windows of the surrounding houses blaze with sudden light. An older woman, clad in pajamas, hurries across the street and kneels by her side, while others from the street gather around her. What happened? What's wrong? The terrified woman looks back at the silent house. She catches her breath and looks up at her neighbor. I know it sounds crazy, but I think my house is haunted. The old woman clucks her tongue sympathetically. Oh, honey, she says, patting the woman's shoulder. I know it is. You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. This is part 2 of my 4-part series about ghost town ghosts, featuring tales of terror and dread with a side of history from one of our country's countless vanished communities. Tonight, a classic ghost story from a long-forgotten town in the interior of British Columbia. This is the story of the haunted house of Waldo, BC. Part 1. The House. House for rent. 2 bed, 1 bath. Fully furnished. $25 per month. When Ed Harper first read the ad in the newspaper, he called the number at the bottom just to confirm it was real. The crackling voice on the line assured him that the low price wasn't a misprint and that he could move in as soon as tomorrow, provided that a check for the first and last month's rent was in the mail. Non-refundable, of course. It seemed strangely underpriced, but then again, Waldo, British Columbia was a strange town. Tucked away in the southern reaches of the Rocky Mountain Trench on the eastern bank of the Kootenay River, the former riverboat stop and lumber town was a jumble of run-down homes, farms, and ranches, a couple of stores, a school, and more than a few abandoned houses. He imagined that, after the mill dried up, whoever stuck around were the kind of folks who liked to live on the edge of things, in the towns and settlements often found in the creases of the map. That suited Ed just fine. The East Kootenays are beautiful country, and a quiet mountain town promised plenty of silence and space. Perfect for a full-time artist looking for a bit of inspiration, and a part-time angler looking for his next big catch. He informed the voice that he would take the house for the summer, and after a quick stop at the bank and then the post office to dutifully mail the check, Ed and his wife Arlene were on their way to Waldo. The 12-hour drive from Fort St. John was easy for the most part, with open roads, wide shoulders, and distant snow-capped mountains framed by blue summer skies. But once they entered the forest south of Jaffrey, the landscape and the mood changed considerably. The trees grew thicker and taller. They cleaved the edges from the roadside, crowded against the cracked asphalt, and blocked every horizon. Thick clumps of swollen clouds descended over the treetops, and Ed felt like they were speeding down a freshly dug ditch, and that, at any moment, those clouds would tear open and the surging waters of a mountain storm would rush beneath their old Chevy and carry them away. It took most of 2 days to get to Waldo, and by the time they rolled in, a moonless night had blanketed the sleepy town. Though the roads and house numbers were nearly indistinguishable in the dark, the place was easy to find. The voice on the telephone had told Ed that his new, temporary home was next door to the school, one of the community's few landmarks still in use. The 2-story Crag Hotel, with its huge porch and balcony, cozy sitting room, and well-appointed bar, had once been the beating heart of the region, serving as a gathering place for all the prospectors, trappers, and lumberjacks who flowed in and out of town during the first half of the 20th century. However, by 1957, the year that the Harpers came to Waldo, the hotel had been boarded up and abandoned for nearly a decade. Its roof left to flake in the sun, its foundation slowly drowning in a sea of tall grass. The school, in contrast, stood proudly on a slight hill with its back to the forest. The lawn and stairs were worn in patches but obviously cared for. The white painted cladding of its broad face and bell tower glowed softly, even in the starlight. The house had a similar feel, slightly frayed but lived in, cared for. A brightly polished grandfather clock stood near the front door. Colorful curtains framed the water-spotted windows of the front room. Several dozen books were neatly stacked on the shelves by the fireplace behind a layer of dust. A few more were strewn across the coffee table and on the bench of the piano. The sofa sagged but was supported by a line of cheerful pillows. The kitchen was rustic but cozy, with its mismatched plates, bowls, and coffee mugs stacked on modest wooden shelves above the sink. The couple retrieved the house key from a small decorative dish on the kitchen counter and continued down the hall to the bedrooms. The first was warm and welcoming, with a heritage bedspread, antique dresser, and view of the garden outside. The second bedroom was decorated much like the first, but it felt different somehow. The light seemed harsher, the ceiling lower. The longer they stood there, the more a mild feeling of discomfort seemed to bubble up from the pit of their stomachs. After a few moments, Arlene took a few impulsive steps backward out of the room, and Ed soon followed, leaving the door open behind him. Without a word spoken between them, they decided that they would sleep in the first room. The second would be used for storage. The Harpers brought in the luggage, the fishing rods, the paints and canvases, and then, exhausted by an entire day of travel, fell into bed. Ed and Arlene were teetering on the edge of sleep when the chimes of the grandfather clock rang out from the front room, marking the half hour. The couple exchanged glances as they realized that, though they had been in the house for hours at that point, that was the first time they had heard the clock do anything more than tick away the seconds. Before a word could be spoken, there was the sudden sound of a door closing in the hallway. This was followed by a second door that squealed on its hinges and slammed shut, the impact reverberating through the wall and headboard. Ed and Arlene leapt from the bed and searched the house, but found nothing. Somehow, the heavy doors to the bathroom and second bedroom had closed on their own. Must have been the wind, Ed suggested, not entirely believing what he was saying. The two crawled back into bed and eventually fell asleep. Their first day in Waldo was spent shopping for groceries, doing a bit of fishing, and introducing themselves to the neighbors, who were eager to meet the newest tenants of the mysterious house next to the school. Many called it the teacher's house, on account of it being routinely rented to people who taught next door, but there were some who knew it by a different name, the haunted house. In fact, the more people they met, the more they were convinced that their new home had a dark reputation. It seemed that many in the village believed that the rock-bottom rental price was due to the fact that the house came with one or more unexpected, unseen, and unwanted roommates. The details were vague, and the belief seemed based more on rumor, speculation, and intuition. All they really knew for sure was that the house felt off somehow, and that those who came before would often complain about unsettling experiences and troubling nightmares. Whether that was true or not, it seemed that whoever rented the quiet house next to the school didn't stay very long. Ed listened politely, but ultimately dismissed their concerns as little more than superstitious nonsense. He didn't really believe in ghosts, but he did believe in the value of an underpriced rental. and any worries he might have had were all but forgotten when he ventured to the river with the fishing rod in his hand. While Ed was out on the Kootenai River, Arlene decided to do a bit of reading. She picked a book from the shelf by the fireplace and sat at the window in the front room, feeling the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. About 3 pages in, she heard a sudden crash from the spare bedroom. She placed her book on the coffee table, rushed down the hall, and opened the door, but found nothing but an empty room, and that terrible, oppressive feeling she and her husband had felt the night before. She turned and began walking back to the couch, but stopped at the end of the hall. Her book was now lying open on the table, its pages slowly turning in the breeze from an open window. She furrowed her brow. Had someone opened the window and somehow forgot? Maybe it was Ed and she just hadn't noticed until now. She felt a sudden chill wrap around her body and hug her shoulders. The room had become freezing cold. She hurried to the other side of the room and slid the window shut, but when she turned back, the pages were flipping even faster than before. She extended her hand, half expecting the pages to bend beneath her outstretched fingers, but the activity stopped as soon as her shadow fell across the table. Arlene didn't tell Ed about the strange events until later that night. She was curled up on the couch and Ed was reclining in the chair when the grandfather clock struck 10:30 and the first half of the Westminster Quarters rang out in dull, metallic tones. The suddenness of the sound made Ed jump. What was wrong with this thing that it would strike only once per day, and at such an odd time? He leapt to his feet, marched to the clock, and threw open the upper door. What he saw was both confusing and alarming. The chime hammers were missing. Someone had removed those components, and without them, the clock should not have been able to make a single sound. But it did. There was no question about that. The copper tubes were still humming, despite the fact that there was nothing that could strike them. Ed looked at Arlene in disbelief and opened his mouth to speak, but his words were cut short when a groan echoed from the hallway. They turned in time to watch the heavy wooden doors of the bathroom and spare bedroom scrape across the floor and click shut. Moments later, the reel of Ed's fishing pole, which leaned by the door, began to spin uncontrollably, faster and faster, piling fishing line upon the floor. Arlene screamed in terror, but Ed couldn't quite grasp what he was seeing. The idea that this was the work of a ghost was incomprehensible. Surely someone was playing a trick on them, trying to scare them. Taking Arlene by the hand, Ed searched the house but could not find an explanation for what was happening. The doors were locked and not a soul could be seen outside. The house was old, certainly, but structurally sound, and even if there was a draft, the solid wood doors were far too heavy to be pushed closed by a simple breeze. When they returned, they found that objects had been rearranged even more. A newspaper, which had been neatly folded and stacked, was now strewn across the table. The books they had been reading when the clock sounded its phantom chime were overturned and open to the last page. It was at that moment that Ed began to rethink his position on the existence of ghosts. That was the summer of 1957 for the Harpers. Every night, for the entire 2 months they lived in that house, the grandfather clock's hands would wind their way to the 10 and the 6, and somewhere inside, a gear would turn and trigger a tiny set of non-existent hammers that would somehow bang out a tune on the machine's copper chimes. Often, this would be followed by the same 2 doors slowly closing on their own. They soon learned and were routinely reminded that the deafening crash that Arlene had heard in the bedroom was the sound of one of the many windows of the house being raised and suddenly dropped by unseen hands. The reels of their fishing rods continued to occasionally spin on their own, tangling the lines into knots, and objects would consistently vanish from where they were placed and reappear elsewhere. But the most consistent phenomenon, after the nightly clock chimes, were the books. Whatever presence occupied that house seemed to obsess over them, pull them from the shelves, move them throughout the house, and flip through every one that was left lying out. The activity was so consistent and so persistent that Arlene came to believe that the ghost was searching for something that had been lost somewhere within their pages. Was it a stash of money? A photograph? A will? A treasure map? A letter of some kind? The Harpers would never find an answer, but they would get one step closer to learning the potential identity of the suspected ghost. As the paranormal activity continued, Ed became increasingly comfortable speaking about his experiences, and one day while mailing a letter, he managed to solve at least part of the mystery. Waldo's postmaster handled the mail, and her little shop was central to life in the community. As a matter of necessity, she knew the names and addresses of nearly every man, woman, and child in the village, and as a matter of course, she was privy to all of its gossip. She told Ed how, long before he and Arlene had come to Waldo, their rental had been home to an elderly man. All of the furnishings and all of the books had belonged to him until his death sometime in the 1940s. It was a time of exodus. After the last mill closed, the town slowly shed its citizens, and many assumed that he had moved elsewhere like all the others. It was over a week before they found him, in the same bedroom where the Harpers now felt an overwhelming feeling of creeping dread. Ed and Arlene continued to live in the house until the end of summer, when they packed up and moved on. At such a low rent, the owner had no trouble finding new tenants, and soon the house was home to another young couple, 2 teachers who had been contracted by the school next door. They intended to live in the house for much longer, at least until the end of the school year, and took it upon themselves to redecorate. It was barely a month before one of them ran screaming into the street at 3 a.m, telling everyone who came running that her house was haunted. All the neighbors could do was offer a sympathetic ear and help them find a quieter, less haunted, more costly place to stay. Some of the locals chuckled when they heard the news because, really, what did they expect for only $25 a month?
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Part 2. The Town. What you just heard was inspired by an account first printed in a book with the accurate but somewhat lackluster title, Some Canadian Ghosts, written by Sheila Hervey. It was a surprise national bestseller back in 1973, but today, half a century later, it's somewhat forgotten and hard to find. The story appeared again 23 years later in Hervey's second book, Ghost to Ghost, with a few minor changes, but the essentials remained the same, presented as a true account that was shared with the author by a couple who stayed in the supposedly haunted house during the summer of 1957. The couple, whose names were changed for their privacy, told how they both felt a profoundly uncomfortable feeling in one of the bedrooms, how windows would slide open and slam shut on their own, how fishing reels would spin, heavy doors would swing closed, objects would disappear and reappear throughout the house, how the pages of books would move as if they were being turned by an unseen hand, and perhaps most chillingly, how the grandfather clock would chime at the same odd time every night, despite the fact that integral parts of that specific mechanism were missing. Hervey also reassures us that many people in Waldo supposedly knew of the house's haunted reputation. Just like you heard at the top of the episode, when one poor renter ran screaming into the street on a dark autumn morning, her suspicions of an otherworldly roommate were supposedly confirmed by the neighbors who came to her aid. All things considered, it's a great spooky story. But is it true? Well, it seems we'll have to take Sheila Hervey's word for it because, as far as I can tell, no other details about this story or any other Waldo ghost story have ever been recorded. That fact might actually strengthen its believability. Waldo was a rowdy, rough-and-tumble lumber town in its early years, full of hard-working and hard-drinking vagabonds who worked the coal mines, ranches, and forests nearby. On August 12, 1912, one of those men, 50-year-old itinerant worker and gambler Martin Haller, shot and killed Billy Palmer, the jovial and well-liked manager of the Crag Hotel. Haller fled and a 2-day manhunt ensued, ending when the provincial police cornered Haller near the Waldo train station and gunned him down. Now, if you were going to make up a spooky tale about the town of Waldo, you'd probably start there, right? I mean, the Rockies are full of supposedly haunted hotels with vague histories and murky supernatural stories. And as the site of an actual cold-blooded murder, the Crag would be the perfect setting for a ghost story. And yet, this story takes place in some standard 2-bedroom house next to a school. The ghost is not the young victim of a tragic murder or a violent killer who died as he lived, but a nameless old man. And that brings up the second reason why this tale might be more believable than most. Think of some of the most famous haunted houses you've heard about. Places like the Sally House in Kansas, where many visitors say they've been scratched until they bled. Or the Ammons House in Indiana, where some believe an infestation of demons tormented a young mother and her 3 children. The ghost in this story is far more subdued. There are no vicious scratches, terrible nightmares, violent possessions, or disembodied voices here. Just a penchant for rifling through books, closing doors, and playing the piano at inconvenient times. The grandfather clock chiming at 10:30 at night, seemingly in spite of all laws of physics, is certainly disturbing, but perhaps not enough to pass up a great deal on rent. And we can understand why, rather than flee from the house, the couple were content to simply live with the ghost for the remainder of their rental agreement. All things considered, it seems likely that this story was at least shared in earnest. And regardless of how you feel about the supernatural, you can't deny that the people who shared it likely experienced something that they couldn't explain. If we are to entertain the possible existence of ghosts, that leaves us with one gnawing question. What did this ghost want? The renters noted that the strange, unseen force seemed preoccupied with the books in the house, and they got the sense that it was searching for something that may have been accidentally lost within their pages. What was it? We can imagine all of the things it may have been, from the fantastical to the mundane, but we'll never know the answer, because in 1973, the same year that Sheila Hervey's book became a bestseller, what was left of Waldo was completely destroyed. Part 3. Where's Waldo? In the late 1940s, the US government began searching for a way to provide more electricity to its western states and improve the nation's energy security. By 1950, they had their answer. They would build a dam on the Kootenai River in northwestern Montana, so wide and so high that, according to one U.S. senator, it would, quote, demonstrate again that man is not powerless to control his environment, end quote. The idea was celebrated as a modern, scientifically orchestrated way to generate hundreds of megawatts of power, control the flood-prone river, reclaim fertile lands in its lower basin, and, in the words of one engineer who led the project, go far towards conserving our natural resources instead of wasting them. Politicians on the north side of the border were excited as well, celebrating the higher degree of flood protection, opportunities for land development, and the potential for future projects. There was just one problem. The dam would create a reservoir roughly 110 meters deep and 145 kilometers long. Half of that would stretch across the border into British Columbia and subsequently drown the hamlet of Waldo, together with all of the farms and ranches nearby. But that was a sacrifice they were willing to make. In 1961, just 4 years after a Waldo school teacher was said to have run screaming from her house in the middle of the night, the Columbia River Treaty was signed, and the ailing town's fate was sealed. The Canadian government offered compensation packages to the people who would be forced to leave their homes, but for many it wasn't enough. There was some outrage and pushback, but eventually the area was abandoned, and in 1973, government agents descended upon the ghost town and burned what was left. The old hotel, the stores, the school, the houses, they all went up in smoke. And their ashes were soon swept away by the waters of the newly formed Lake Kookan, USA, a portmanteau combining the words Kootenay, Canada, and USA. The locals request that we pronounce it that way, Kookan, USA, rather than, say, Kookanusa, to prevent others from mistaking the name as an indigenous word and thus mistaking the lake as a natural body of water. There's no way of knowing what happened to the little house next to the school. Was it one of the few structures that were moved from their foundations and repurposed somewhere else? Did the owner return for their beds, books, and half-broken grandfather clock? Or did they simply allow all of it to be burned? The latter seems the most likely. And what about the ghost? Was it tethered to the house? To the mysterious object that may have been hidden away inside one of the books? Or to the land itself? Did the spirit finally find peace as the home burned? Or does it still wander the lake bottom where the house once stood, listening for the clock that once chimed the moment of their death, and eternally searching amongst the lakeweed for a book that no longer exists? There are countless ghost towns scattered all across British Columbia. Most have been swallowed up by the natural world and largely forgotten. But for many, a part of them still lingers in the empty spaces and overgrown foundations at the ragged ends of rocky, decommissioned roads stretching far into the wilderness. With the right research and the right gear, we can visit these places, touch the soil and walk the ground where others once walked. But the same can't be said for Waldo. It is a drowned town, one of the many settlements that were destroyed by floods following the Columbia River Treaty. Beaton, a former steamboat landing, now lies beneath the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. Renata, a former Mennonite community, was also submerged after the construction of the Keenly Side Dam near Castlegar. The community's graveyard, paved over with a thick concrete slab, can occasionally be spotted just below the lake's surface, the waters lapping at its smooth, gray face. There are people still living today who have fond memories of these former communities, but who can never return home. All that's left are the memories and the stories. The name of Waldo lives on in Waldo Cove, a secluded regional park on the northeastern shore of Lake Kookan, USA. It has a 4.5 rating on Google Maps, and it's noted for its soft sand, plentiful picnic spots, and spectacular views. In the summer, when the lake is warm and a gentle breeze ripples across the water, families journey south down Highway 93 to fish, boat, and swim. But how many of those families know about the history that lies just beneath them? How many know that a small village once stood where trout and bass now reel in the sunlight? How many would venture out on their paddle boards and floating chairs if they knew that a ghost might be lurking below, just beyond that sunlight? And when that sun is long set, the families have all gone home, and the birds are silent, is it possible that the faint chimes of an old grandfather clock might still be heard ringing out in the darkness? A special signature of a time and a life now past. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it. And remember, next time you head to the lake, take a moment to consider what might be lying and waiting beneath. Fireside Canada is written and recorded by me, David Williams, with sound design by Matt Kesselman. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our business manager. Jordan Heath Rawlings is our executive producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving this podcast a positive review. If you want to help even further, you can provide story ideas and more through my website. Every little bit helps to keep the fire burning and the Library of Legends growing. Learn more at firesidecanada.ca.
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.